Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I am Felita Griffin, Chief Senior ADA assigned to the Major Case Unit at the Fulton County DA's office. And along with my esteemed colleagues, Mr. Clint Rucker, Ms. Kara Convery, Mr. Adam Abadi, and Ms. Siri Elamjarou, it is an honor to represent Diane McIver, the citizens of Fulton County, and the state of Georgia in the prosecution of this case. The defendant in this case is charged with 7 counts in the indictment. Counts 1 through 4 encompass the murder of Diane McIver. And counts 5 through 7 are about the influencing of witnesses to cover up what he did to her. Now, this is a case about maintaining an image of wealth and power that the defendant created for himself and the lengths that he went through to keep it. Now, I'll give you a little bit of background about the relationship between Diane McIver and the defendant. Now, they were married in 2005, and this was the second marriage for both of them. And they were both successful in their own right. And they decided to keep their finances separate. The defendant was a partner at Fisher & Phillips, which is a large law firm with many offices across the United States. And he had been there for 40 years and was making a nice living for himself. The defendant was politically influential. He sat on a lot of boards and committees and was very active within the community of Atlanta and Putnam County. Diane McIver started as a bookkeeper at Quarry Company, and she worked her way up to become the president and CEO of U.S. Enterprises. And you will hear from witnesses that Diane was a shrewd businesswoman, and her knowledge and expertise propelled U.S. Enterprises into a multi-million-dollar company. And in addition to her role at U.S. Enterprises, she owned 3 other companies: Clay Management, DRS Investments, and Diane Smith Interiors. And at the time of their marriage, she was worth $12 million. Diane was very career-driven, and she never had any kids. But she had a godson named Austin that she loved dearly. And she was a very active part of his life from the minute that he was born. The McIvers had it all. They had this lavish condo up in Buckhead, decked out with the most expensive and extravagant things that Diane could find. And they had this sprawling ranch out in Putnam County. It sat on over 60 well-manicured acres of land. It had a guest house, a saloon, horses and cows. It was beautiful. It was picture perfect. The McIvers had the storybook life. And you'll hear from witnesses that they never argued, that they never saw them argue, that they thought that everything was okay. But things weren't as they seemed. And on September 25th, 2016, the day that the defendant shot his wife in the back, his life was spinning out of control. The partnership that he had in 2005 at Fisher & Phillips was gone. He lost his partnership in 2014 and was planning on retiring in December of 2017. And over the 3-year period, his salary dropped 54%. He had become dependent upon Diane. And over the 3-year period from 2013 to 2016, our financial expert, Mr. Dean Driscoll, will testify that he received $198,000 from Diane McIver. In addition to the $198,000 that he received from her, she gave him a loan for $350,000 in 2011. This wasn't a, hey, you can pay me back whenever you get the money. This was an actual loan with a promissory note. and the loan was secured by the ranch out in Putnam County. And based on his financial condition, the defendant would not be able to repay this loan. In fact, the evidence will show that in 2011, when she gave him the loan, it was due in 2014, and he hadn't paid it. So she renewed it so that it would be due in December of 2017. And the evidence will show that over that period, he made interest-only payments and never paid any money on the principal. Diane had told Ann Schwall, the mother of Austin, that she was going to leave the ranch to her godson. And Diane loved Austin so much, she would never draft a will without Austin being included in it. And the evidence will show, we will have Mr. Carlton Morsa, expert in real estate, testify that unless Diane McIver foreclosed on the ranch and took control of it, she couldn't leave the ranch to Austin. The evidence will show that Diane could take control of the ranch by foreclosing on it if the defendant did not pay. Defendant did have a pension, and our expert would testify that based upon his spending habits, it would be depleted in 2 years after he retired. And in addition to that, without the money from Diane that he was receiving every month, on the time of her death, the defendant wouldn't even have $1. As a matter of fact, without Diane's money, on the day that she died, his account would have been negative over $5,000. You're going to hear that when she drafted the will in 2016, the ranch would go to the defendant. If she foreclosed on the ranch, it was her intent for the ranch to go to Austin. And you're going to hear in the days after Diane was shot, and the defendant goes to talk to 2 homicide detectives at APD. And without any prompting, he tells them, "I like to be in control." And on September 25th, 2016, Diane was making all of the money. Diane owned the 2 condos in Buckhead. Diane could take the ranch. This ranch, according to the witnesses, that was his pride and joy. This ranch that he would go to every weekend, that he would host parties at, that he would go shooting at, Diane could take from him. On Diane's death, he went from negative $5,000 to over $1.1 million cash instantly. And he was the executor and one of the beneficiaries of Diane's $7 million estate. The easiest way for him to gain control was to kill Diane. And on Sunday, September 25th, 2016, the evidence will show that that is just what he did. The day started off in Putnam County, and they went golfing out at Reynolds Plantation. And it was Diane McIver, the defendant, and one of her co-workers, Mr. Craig Stringer. And Danny Jo Carter, one of Diane's longtime friends, had went and spent the weekend out at the ranch with the couple, but she didn't go golfing. After they went golfing, they came back to the ranch, picked up Danny Jo Carter, and then they went to have dinner at the Longhorn Steakhouse in Conyers. During the dinner, Diane McIver and the defendant had something to drink, so Danny Jo Carter was driving the truck. They were in a huge white Ford Expedition. And Danny Jo was driving. Diane McIver was in the front passenger seat. And the defendant was seated right behind her. And as they're taking 20, going towards Atlanta, As they approach the downtown connector to go 75-85 north to head to Buckhead, traffic stops. And not wanting to sit in traffic, Danny Jo Carter takes the first exit that she could. And that would be the exit off of 75-85 at Edgewood Avenue. Once she takes that exit, she makes a left onto Edgewood Avenue, goes about 3 blocks, and then she makes a right on Piedmont. Danny Jo Carter will testify that she really wasn't paying any attention to the defendant. And after they exited on the highway, he asked for his gun. And Diane McIver opened the console and picked up a gun that was in a plastic Publix bag. Handed it to the defendant, not knowing that that would be the weapon that ended her life. She says Danny Jo Carter would testify that as they're heading down Piedmont, her and Diane are talking. And she's not really paying any attention to the defendant. She'll testify that she remembers crossing over Ponce. She remembers going straight over to 10th Street. And she remembers that either at 12th Street or 14th Street, as she's sitting at a red light, she hears a gunshot. Diane says, "Tex, what did you do?" She looks back and she sees the defendant sitting in the back. She sees a puff of smoke, and she sees him in the back with this gun in a plastic bag, and he's moving it around. And then she looks back over at Diane. And she says Diane is writhing in pain. And she says, "Tex, I think you shot me." And then she keeps moving around, and then she loses consciousness. Danny Jo is panicking. She is freaked out. She had never been in a situation like this before. And in her mind, she's thinking that Piedmont would be the closest hospital to take Diane McIver to. But she can't remember how to get there from where she is. So the defendant tells her, "Let's go to Emory." And she'll testify that she says, "I don't know how to get there either." And he says, "I'll give you directions." So she presses the gas, starts honking the horn because there are cars in front of her, trying to get around. And she's driving as fast as she could. She goes past Ansley Mall, makes that right on Morningside, and she's going down that road, zooming, running stop signs, running red lights. And the Morningside area is a two-way street. And it was dark. And she was trying to do the best that she could for Diane. Now, the time that it took to get them to Emory, due to discrepancies in the cameras, it will not be precise. But what we do have is that Danny Jo remembers is that it took 10 to 15 minutes for them to get to Emory University Hospital on Clifton. And another thing that she remembers is that as they're driving back there on Morningside, it turns to East Rock Springs Road, and they're getting closer to Emory. They're approaching a roundabout, and she's driving as fast as she could. And she says the defendant comes up to her, and he tells her, "Slow down." Slow down. There may be women walking their babies in baby carriages at 10 o'clock at night. She'll tell you that she pays them no mind, and she keeps right on to Emory Hospital. And they get there, and you'll see that they come up to the valet, and at some point the defendant gets out of the truck, and you'll see him walking casually up to the entryway. And you'll hear testimony that he says, gunshot wound. And ladies and gentlemen, somehow the defendant wants you to believe that the death of Diane McIver was an accident. But ladies and gentlemen, this was no accident at all. And the evidence will show that this was indeed murder. All of the events on September 25th, 2016 by the defendant were planned, intentional, and calculated. And we'll start from putting the gun in the plastic bag. Our expert will testify that the result of putting a gun in a plastic bag and shooting it prevents gunshot residue from getting on your hands and clothes. In addition to putting the gun in a plastic bag, 8 hours before the murder, the defendant asked Tanner McKinney to take Danny Jo Carter back to Atlanta. Now, Tanner McKinney and Samantha Watson are two young adults that come out to the ranch on a couple of Sundays out of the month in order to groom the horses and to walk them or to ride them. Tanner will testify that he lives in Athens. And he'll testify that he remembers the defendant asking him this because he knew that Danny Jo Carter lived in Atlanta. So he was confused by the request of the defendant to take Danny Jo to the opposite side of where he lived. In addition to that, our expert, Michael Knox, who is a crime scene reconstructionist and an expert in ballistics and firearms, recreated this crime scene. He took measurements, photos, and he recreated the circumstances of that night. And based upon the trajectory of the bullet and the injuries to Diane, he concluded that the gun was aimed at her back. It wasn't on her lap, it didn't accidentally discharge, it was aimed right at her back. The gun that was used, the .38 revolver, was in perfect working condition. It was tested by the GBI and Michael Knox. They fired it, and they did other testing on it to determine that it had no hair trigger. In double action, it required 12 pounds of trigger pull for it to fire. And in single action, it was 2.5 pounds. Michael Knox determined that the revolver could not be fired accidentally, that the defendant had to intentionally pull the trigger and it couldn't just go off. During a search of the condos in Atlanta and the condos in Atlanta and the ranch out in Putnam County, 44 guns were seized. Some of them belonged to Diane, but a majority of the guns belonged to the defendant. And there were handguns seized, including revolvers and semi-automatics, rifles, shotguns, and a trick or a poker gun. And Tanner McKinney and Samantha Watson will also testify about how the defendant demonstrated to them how to use that gun. And what they'll testify about is that he showed them the gun after a tour of the ranch. And he told them that in order to fire the gun, you had to know all of the special steps to get it to fire. And that he was the only one that can operate the gun, and he showed them how to do it. The defendant had a makeshift firing range at the ranch. It was a huge mound of dirt back in the back. And you'll hear witnesses testify that he would go back there and shoot all the time. And he lectured others about gun safety. He would take Austin back there and shoot, and a number of other friends. And they will testify that over and over again, he would lecture them about gun safety. And you'll also hear Danny Joe Carter tell you about a time when a defendant threw a water bottle up in the air, shot it 2 times before it hit the ground. In addition to the gun being in perfect working condition, at the time of the incident, there was no 911 call. The defendant was seated in the back seat, and right beside him, within arm's reach, was his cell phone. And then right beside that on the seat, in her purse, was Diane's cell phone. And right beside that, also within arm's reach, was Danny Joe Carter's purse. And in her purse was her cell phone. And the evidence will show that none of these phones called 911 on that night. Once the defendant got to Emory, people started asking questions, and the nurses and the staff wanted to know what happened to Diane McIver. And you will hear that over the course of time, the defendant gives 6 different versions of what happened to Diane McIver in the car that night. You will hear from 3 doctors and about 8 nurses from Emory University Hospital. And none of them knew anything about Diane McIver or the defendant or Danny Joe Carter. You'll hear from Dr. Celine Shabler. She's an emergency room doctor. And you'll hear that on that night, when Diane McIver came in, she was actually getting off of work as the attending physician in the emergency room. And Dr. Suzanne Hardy was taking over. But since Emory University Hospital rarely deals with gunshot wounds, she decided to stay and help. So as Dr. Hardy was working on Diane McIver, she was doing little things for her. Like she went and ordered labs and did things like that. Would come back and get updates for the defendant. So one time after she went to talk to Dr. Hardy and asked her how was Diane McIver, and she told her that they were working on her and to go see how the defendant was doing. So she walks to the family consult room and the defendant is sitting in there alone. And they're talking and she asks him what happened. And what he tells her is that they were driving in a bad neighborhood and Diane asked for the gun. And she reached in a console and got it. And then she took the gun and she put it behind her back. And as they were driving, it went off. And that's how she got shot in the back. Then he told another nurse that as he was cleaning his gun in the bathroom, it went off and shot Diane in the back. And on this same night, he told another nurse that the gun went off while he was holding it in the back seat, and that's how Diane was shot. You're going to hear from Dr. Suzanne Hardy, who was the treating physician of Diane McIver. And as she's working on Diane, she's trying to figure out what happened. Because at this time, she saw 2 holes in Diane. One in the front and one in the back. And she was trying to determine, was it 1 gunshot wound or was it 2? So she asked Diane what happened. And Diane says, I was holding it behind my back when the gun went off. Dr. Hardy will testify that she thought this sounded odd, so she asked her again, "You were holding the gun?" And then Diane says, "He was holding it behind my back." Then about 30 seconds pass, and Diane states it was an accident. Dr. Hardy continues to work on Diane and continues to try to save her life. And as time passes, she knows that Diane isn't doing so well and that she might not survive. And she'll testify that Diane looked at her and was like, "I'm dying." And not wanting to tell her the truth, what she did was she said, "We're doing the best we can. You're getting the best care possible. But at this point, I'm going to need to intubate you." And to intubate is to put a tube down her throat. And she was like, "After I put this down your throat, you won't be able to speak." And what she does is she asks Diane a question. She asks Diane, "Do you want to see your husband?" And Diane says, "No." While the defendant was telling all of these stories and trying to change the narrative of what really happened, he had one big problem, and that was Danny Joe Carter. And the evidence is going to show that after they arrived at Emory, what he did was he told Danny Joe, "These situations can get a little bit crazy. So why don't you tell the police that you were not in the SUV tonight and that you just arrived at the hospital sometime later?" And Danny Joe told him, "I'm not doing that. I'm not going to say that because that's not true." And in addition to trying to get her to lie at the hospital, he also pressured her to hold a press conference to proclaim his innocence. And she didn't want to do that either. And what he did was he sent a car to her house to pick her up. And what Danny Joe had done is her and her husband, Tom Carter, left. And they went to the home of Dale Cardwell. And some of you may know who that is. He's a TV personality. He reviews businesses. And they went to his home. And he'll testify that when they got there, Danny Joe was upset. And when the defendant couldn't get a hold of Danny Joe, he repeatedly started calling Tom Carter. He's calling and calling and calling and calling. He's blowing up his phone. And he leaves 3 messages. And one of the messages, he tells Tom to tell Danny Joe to stop saying what she's saying, because it could end him up in jail. And what he tells him is, after you listen to this message, delete this message. And you'll hear it. In addition to trying to get Danny Joe to do this press conference, he also called his longtime friend, Mr. William Bill Crane, who's a TV personality, talks about political issues on TV, and they have been friends for about 33 years. So he calls him to be his public relations specialist for this issue. And so what he does is, he wants to get his side of the story out to the media, because at this time the media is starting to speculate about what happened. And so what he tells Bill Crane is that as they're exiting at Edgewood, and they turn under Edgewood, and they're going under the overpass, he asks for his gun because he believes that the truck may be attacked by either some Black Lives Matters protesters or some homeless people. And he says that's why he asked for his gun. And then once they got into Piedmont, or a safer area, he dozed off and went to sleep. And then as they were going along, they hit a bump and the gun went off. And that's how Diane got shot in the back. So Bill Crane will testify that he wrote the story down, sent the version over to the defendant, said, is this all right? Is this what you want me to release? And he got the okay. And then what Mr. Crane did was start distributing it out to media outlets. And once the story got to the media, there was a big backlash about it. And the defendant's attorney at the time, Mr. Steve Maples, and the defendant started calling Bill Crane and asking him to retract the story. They asked him to say that he misrepresented what the defendant said, and that the defendant had never actually said that. And he refused to lie for the defendant. And as a matter of fact, the day before he gave the statement to Bill Crane, he had went down to talk to two APD homicide detectives. And when he gave them a version of events, he said that he asked for the gun because they were in a bad neighborhood, and then he fell asleep. He was in a twilight type of zone when he woke up, and then the gun just went off. And never in that version did he say anything about Black Lives Matter or a bump. After Diane McIver died, less than a week after she died, the defendant began to inventory all of her belongings. Her jewelry, her clothes, her hats, shoes, everything that she had, he began to inventory it so that he could sell it. And what the defendant told media outlets and journalists is that he was doing this in order to satisfy the bequests in her will. And he had an estate sale and an auction and raised over $187,000. And the evidence will show that to this date, not one of those bequests have been paid. In Diane's will, she desired to be cremated. And you will hear evidence that after her autopsy on September 26th, she was transferred to Phoenix Funeral Services to be cremated. And that she was cremated on September 29th. After she's cremated, Miss Wendy Edson, the owner of the crematory, calls the defendant and says, hey, you could come and pick up your wife. He doesn't show. She calls back and says, hey, you could pick up your wife. And what he tells her is that he has to wait for the estate to start being probated so that her estate could pay for her cremation. And so another week passes, and another week, and on October 28th, Diane McIver is still down at the crematory. And one of her friends from a long time ago, Miss Kathy Johansson, learned that Diane was down there, and she paid for it anonymously. And all she asked for was one small memento of Diane. And it wasn't a $5,000 fee. It wasn't a $4,000 fee. It was $1,600 that she paid to get the remains. And he doesn't stop there, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. When all of this other stuff that he was trying to do didn't work, what he did was, after he fired Bill Crane for not retracting the story, he hired Mr. Jeff Dickerson. Now, Mr. Jeff Dickerson is also a public relations specialist. And he's been in the business for a long time. You all may know him from seeing him on Sundays as part of the Georgia game. And what you will learn is that Mr. Dickerson was a longtime friend of my boss, Mr. Paul Howard, over 20 years. And what he'll testify to is that after he was hired by the defendant, he was called down to his lawyer's office. And the defendant and his lawyer were sitting at a table. Then the lawyer gets up to leave. And it's just the defendant and Mr. Dickerson. And what he tells Mr. Dickerson is, you can get this case dismissed. You can get this case dismissed. And if you do, there's a large bonus in it for you. And I won't mind if you share it with the DA. Now, ladies and gentlemen, at the close of all of the state's evidence, Mrs. Kara Convery will get up here, followed by Mr. Clint Rucker, and they'll perform closing arguments. And what the state will ask you to do is to return a verdict. The only verdict that speaks the truth in this case is a verdict of guilty.